In 1920, Britain controlled the largest empire humanity had ever seen. 1/4 of the planet's landmass flew the Union Jack. Over 450 million people lived under British rule. London was the financial capital of the world, and the Royal Navy ruled every sea. Britain stood as the undisputed global power. Less than 4 decades later, in 1956, Britain needed American permission just to defend its own strategic interests. A decade after that, in 1967, the currency crumbled. 9 years later, in 1976, Britain went begging to the International Monetary Fund for emergency loans, completely humiliated. The nation that had dominated the globe for 2 centuries became a struggling European state in barely 3 decades. The standard narrative says Britain gave up its empire due to independence movements, ethical evolution, and decolonization. There's some truth there, but it misses the fundamental reality. Britain didn't surrender its empire by choice. Britain lost its empire because the treasury was empty. Not ethically empty, literally empty. Britain emerged from World War II victorious on the battlefield, but destroyed in the balance sheets. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through precisely how Britain went from global dominance to financial dependence, how America seized Britain's position as the world's leading power, and why understanding Britain's downfall is essential for grasping the economic pressures facing superpowers today. Because empires don't voluntarily step down, they collapse when they can't pay the bills anymore. Following the Great War, the British Empire reached its absolute zenith. By 1920, British territory encompassed 13.7 million square miles. That represents nearly 1/4 of all land on Earth. British authority extended over 458 million human beings, roughly 1/5 of everyone alive. With possessions spanning every continent, it genuinely was the empire where the sun never set. But physical territory was never Britain's true source of strength. Financial power was. Sterling functioned as the global reserve currency. World commerce moved in pounds. Foreign governments stockpiled pounds as their national reserves. London's financial district stood as the unrivaled center of global finance. Britain was the planet's biggest creditor. British financial institutions funded infrastructure worldwide. British capital owned South American railways, African mining operations, Indian agriculture, and industrial concerns across 6 continents. This monetary supremacy allowed Britain to access capital at the world's most favorable interest rates, which enabled cheap financing of its enormous military apparatus and debt-funded colonial governance. It dominated international commerce because it dominated both currency and credit. The foundation was the gold standard. Sterling was convertible to physical gold at a set exchange rate. This wasn't merely symbolic, it meant pounds possessed genuine intrinsic worth. Anyone could present paper currency at a bank and receive actual gold in return. This created trust and stability, which explains why sterling became the world's preferred currency. Britain's economy wasn't technically the world's largest. America had already overtaken it in absolute size. But for an island of just 44 million inhabitants, British economic output was staggering, second globally only to the United States. British coal, British steel, British textiles, and British industrial equipment powered global development. And supporting everything was the Royal Navy, still the most powerful maritime force in existence. In 1920, Britain appeared unshakable, but the financial foundation was already developing fissures. The Great War delivered the first devastating blow. Between 1914 and 1918, the conflict drained roughly £35 billion from Britain's coffers. That figure might seem manageable by modern standards, but measured against Britain's economy at that time, it was absolutely devastating. For context, Britain's total GDP in 1914 stood at approximately £2.5 billion. The war consumed 14 times the nation's entire annual economic production. Where did this staggering sum originate? The first source was taxation. Britain dramatically increased tax burdens. Income tax, which had been negligible for ordinary citizens before 1914, soared to 30% or higher. Yet even these punishing tax rates couldn't generate sufficient revenue for the war's appetite. The second source was debt. Britain borrowed aggressively from its own population through war bonds, but critically it also took on enormous debt from the United States. For the first time in modern history, Britain transformed from a creditor nation into a debtor to America. By 1918, Britain's government debt had exploded from £650 million to more than £7.4 billion. an 11-fold multiplication in just 4 years. The third source was asset sales. To purchase armaments and war materials, Britain had no choice but to liquidate overseas investments. Before the war, British citizens and institutions owned massive foreign assets. By the war's end, much of that wealth had been sold off. Then there was the currency crisis. In 1914, Britain abandoned the gold standard to enable money printing for war financing. The pound, which had been literally as reliable as gold for generations, suddenly became mere paper backed by government promises. Britain attempted to return to gold backing in 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate. This proved to be a catastrophic error. Sterling was dramatically overvalued, making British exports prohibitively expensive in international markets. This policy strangled British economic growth, producing deflation and mass unemployment throughout the 1920s. The fundamental damage had occurred, though it remained partially concealed. Britain had transformed from the world's dominant creditor into a major debtor nation. The United States had transformed from debtor to creditor. The global balance of financial power had undergone a fundamental restructuring, but most observers hadn't yet grasped the implications. Superficially, Britain still appeared to dominate the world, but underneath it was barely holding on. If the First World War was financially devastating, the Second World War was the final annihilating blow. The second conflict cost Britain an additional £28 billion, but once again, the raw number obscures the real story. Relative to Britain's weakened economy, this represented an unbearable load. Britain fought the Second World War through complete national mobilization. At the conflict's height, an astonishing 55% of Britain's entire GDP went to military expenditures. Essentially, more than half the economy existed solely to support the war machine. Food, fuel, clothing, everything was strictly rationed. Every available resource flowed toward a single objective: national survival. This was economically unsustainable. Britain was consuming its remaining wealth, liquidating whatever assets remained, and accumulating debt at a pace that would destroy any economy. By 1941, Britain teetered on the edge of total collapse. America intervened with Lend-Lease. The United States would provide Britain with weapons, food, and critical supplies, with repayment expected after victory. But this wasn't altruism. America charged interest on these provisions, and in return for this economic lifeline, Britain had to accept American conditions. Those conditions included dismantling imperial trade preferences, allowing American business access to British imperial markets, and submitting to American financial supervision. Essentially, Britain was exchanging its empire for immediate survival. America was purchasing global supremacy at bargain prices. The outcome was debt catastrophe. By 1945, Britain's government debt reached 250% of GDP. Let me emphasize that. The debt was 2.5 times larger than Britain's entire annual economic output. For perspective, current U.S. debt sits around 123% of GDP. Greece, during its worst debt emergency, peaked at roughly 180%. Britain in 1945 was in an entirely different category. It was catastrophic. To service this debt mountain, Britain had to liquidate virtually everything of value. Foreign investments were sold, gold stockpiles were depleted, overseas properties, artwork, buildings, anything with market value was auctioned off. By 1945, Britain had completed its transformation from the planet's largest creditor to its largest debtor. It took only 30 years and 2 global conflicts. Britain was now entirely dependent on American goodwill. It owed the United States over $4.3 billion as of 1945, which sounds modest, but represented a crushing weight on its devastated economy. Britain required American loans just for basic survival, to prevent starvation among its population. While war still raged, America and Britain convened at Bretton Woods to architect the post-war monetary system. Britain, represented by economist John Maynard Keynes, advocated for a neutral international currency unit. But America, represented by Harry Dexter White, had different plans. They proposed making the dollar the new reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Britain, financially ruined by 2 world wars, had no bargaining position. America controlled all leverage, and thus the dollar displaced sterling. This wasn't a minor technical adjustment. It was the most significant power transfer of the 20th century. What does reserve currency status actually mean? It means global commerce requires your currency. It generates perpetual worldwide demand for your money. It means you can sustain enormous trade deficits indefinitely, because the world requires your currency for transactions. You can borrow at the lowest possible interest rates and your financial sector dominates globally. For 2 centuries, Britain enjoyed these extraordinary privileges. In an instant, they transferred to the United States. Immediately, sterling came under pressure. Britain attempted to maintain the pound's value after the war, but the underlying economics were broken. National debt stood at 250% of GDP. The economy was shattered. Britain was running massive trade deficits, and the dollar now reigned supreme. Sterling was grotesquely overvalued, and everyone understood this reality. But admitting it meant admitting Britain was no longer a great power. The first humiliation arrived in 1949. Britain was compelled to devalue sterling by 30%, dropping from $4.03 to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currencies. Yet even this drastic step didn't address the core problem. Britain simply could not afford to maintain its empire anymore. Consider the expenses involved. Empire maintenance meant military bases scattered across the planet, naval forces in every ocean, enormous colonial bureaucracies, infrastructure development, and constant military operations against independence movements. Britain's economy was half America's size, yet it was attempting to maintain a global military and administrative presence that the mathematics simply didn't support. The breaking point, the moment when the world recognized the emperor wore no clothes, was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a critical shipping route, especially for Middle Eastern oil exports. Britain, which held 44% ownership in the canal company, refused to accept this seizure. Together with France and Israel, they launched military action to recapture the canal. Militarily, the operation succeeded. Within days, British and French forces controlled the canal zone. But then America intervened. President Eisenhower was outraged. He opposed the military operation and threatened to destroy Britain economically, not militarily, but financially. America threatened economic sanctions, oil supply cutoffs, and most devastatingly, dumping its massive holdings of British pounds on currency markets. This would have obliterated sterling's value. America also refused to support emergency IMF loans that Britain desperately needed. It was naked financial coercion. Britain's foreign exchange reserves were evaporating. Sterling was collapsing. America delivered an unambiguous ultimatum: withdraw from Suez immediately or face complete economic destruction. Britain had no alternative. Despite military success, they withdrew in total humiliation. Suez revealed the new global order. British military capability was worthless without American financial backing. The empire was a hollow shell, and America now controlled the levers of power. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. Sterling came under renewed assault, and throughout the empire, independence movements recognized Britain's weakness, accelerating their campaigns. Suez didn't cause the empire's end, but it made that end obvious and inevitable. The deterioration continued. In 1967, Britain devalued sterling again, cutting another 14% from its value. Prime Minister Harold Wilson appeared on television and infamously claimed that the pound in your pocket hadn't lost value. It was a transparent lie and a desperate one. This marked the second major devaluation in under 20 years. Why did this keep repeating? Britain was trapped in a vicious cycle of importing more than it exported, accumulating trade deficits year after year. When you possess the reserve currency, you can sustain this indefinitely. But Britain no longer had that privilege. It had to purchase imports with foreign currencies, and those reserves were constantly depleting. The Bank of England would attempt to defend sterling by selling reserves and raising interest rates dramatically. But it was a futile fight. Devaluation was always the inevitable outcome. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Britain earned the label sick man of Europe. The nation suffered from stagflation, the toxic combination of high inflation and economic stagnation. Labor strikes crippled industries. The oil shock made matters worse. Manufacturing industries collapsed, and a brain drain sent Britain's most talented professionals to America. The nation that had been Earth's wealthiest just half a century earlier was now in managed decline. The ultimate humiliation arrived in 1976. Facing yet another currency crisis, Britain was forced to approach the International Monetary Fund, an institution it had helped establish, and plead for emergency funding. The IMF provided the bailout, but imposed harsh conditionality. slash government expenditures, increase interest rates, implement austerity measures. The nation that once governed a quarter of humanity was now following orders from international technocrats. During these years, Britain rapidly dismantled its empire. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, Malaysia in 1957, most African territories throughout the 1960s, until the final significant possession, Hong Kong, was transferred in 1997. The official narrative speaks of moral progress, of voluntarily granting independence. The truth was Britain was bankrupt. Every colonial possession was a net financial drain. The empire had to be abandoned because Britain couldn't pay for it anymore. So what's the fundamental lesson? Britain's collapse followed an identifiable sequence. First, catastrophic debt accumulation from warfare. Second, loss of reserve currency dominance. Third, chronic deficits from consuming beyond productive capacity. Fourth, repeated currency devaluations. Fifth, dependence on foreign creditors. And ultimately, loss of political sovereignty and forced asset liquidation. Now examine the United States today. Debt accumulation. We're approaching $36 trillion from decades of deficit spending. Erosion of dollar dominance. It's gradual but undeniably occurring. Persistent trade deficits? Absolutely. Currency depreciation? The dollar has lost more than 86% of its purchasing power since abandoning gold. Rising debt servicing costs? Interest payments on federal debt now surpass total defense spending. Constrained freedom of action increasingly evident. The final phase for Britain was empire liquidation. The frightening question for America is, what assets do we liquidate? The crucial difference is velocity. Britain took approximately 30 years to transition from dominant global empire to IMF supplicant. In today's hyper-connected digital financial environment, what required 3 decades for Britain could happen to America in half that time if current trajectories persist. The historical lesson is unambiguous. Britain didn't choose to relinquish its empire. Economic reality forced that choice. Empires don't end through moral evolution. They end when they run out of money. Financial strength is the only strength that ultimately matters. Military power is irrelevant if you cannot afford to sustain it. And controlling the world's reserve currency is the ultimate form of power. Britain learned this lesson painfully. America might be next. If this changed your understanding of history, make sure to subscribe. I analyze the economic forces that actually shape our world. Drop a comment with your prediction. How long until the US faces its own Suez moment? Thanks for watching.